You ready? Okay, so Kinley, stop renegating. Unit 6 is about imperialism, right? So this is a reaction to industrialization. First big idea that everybody needs to know that you have to have for this unit is that industrialization directly leads us to imperialization. Without one, the other probably would not have happened, but more importantly, imperialization would not have been able to happen. And we're going to talk about why in just a moment. What you see in 6.1, which is our first topic, is all about the rationales for imperialism. The reason Europe imperialized was what? What did they want? Resources. And they justified this imperialization using these ideas. The next thing I want you to write down is this point right here. Competition among industrialized states increased the need of colonies. So we see European states here sort of fighting for power over places like Southeast Asia, South Asia, which is China, Africa, and other little bits. Then the other thing that you need to know is that they use things like social Darwinism to justify their expansion into other parts of the world. And we'll talk more specifically about what social Darwinism is in just a second. So again, imperialism, you may want to write this definition down. It is the establishment of overseas empires motivated by a belief in nationalism, a desire for economic wealth, sometimes a sense of religious duty, and a belief that Europeans were biologically superior. You have to understand this belief amongst Europeans that because of their birth, they are superior. Europeans also believe that they are superior to the West, to the East, to China and India and places like that because of industrialization. I would write that down as well. They believe that because of industrialization, they are scientifically and technologically far superior to places like India, China, Africa. Now, can you maybe make an argument that at this time they were more advanced in these places when it comes to technology? Sure. But the problem is they said that they were better than the rest of the world because they had this ability. So we see Great Britain starts imperializing first, and it's because they lose their colonies in North America. So they have to find resources somewhere else. Great Britain is a tiny island. They don't have a lot of stuff naturally. France, Italy, and Germany also start expanding for prestige. That means they want to look good. They want the global world to think that they are awesome. And then Japan, much like with industrialization, Japan sees the rest of the major powers of the world imperializing, and they're like, oh, I better do the same thing. So Japan starts trying to get colonies in Korea. These are some of the cultural and religious motivations for imperialization. You have to know what social Darwinism is. This is a cornerstone of imperialization. It is the idea that Europeans and descendants of Europeans, so white people basically, are biologically superior to non-white people. We know now that that is pseudoscience, that is fake, right? The practice of phrenologists, those are people that examine skull size, was one of the predominant leaders of the social Darwin theory. The idea that because Europeans had bigger skulls, which is not true, that they had bigger brains and were more intelligent. All of that is based in falsehoods. So social Darwinism is used to encourage imperialism. Also write this down, the idea of like the civilizing mission. It is the mission of Europeans to civilize. What poem did we look at that talked about that? The White Man's Burden, right? It said, oh, we Europeans, we don't want to imperialize. We must. We have to. It is our burden to do so. So that is kind of the justification socially of imperialization. And then again, I want you to make sure you recognize that Europeans felt like they were biologically, culturally, technologically, scientifically superior to the rest of the world. So this idea of superiority led to imperialization. The final sort of motivation for imperialization was religious. Missionaries obviously always spread culture. Missionaries were not all bad. They opened schools. They tried to stop slavery. They improved medicine. But for the most part, even missionaries were in this for to help spread imperialization of their colony or their country. Economic motivations for imperialization. You do not need to write all of this business down, but what would be important for you to know is that the British East India Company went to India. The Dutch East India Company monopolized trade between the tip of Africa and South America and like the Spice Islands, Indonesia, that area, Indian Ocean. And those two companies were sort of the first little onset of imperialization in these nations. So you need to know British East India Company, India, Dutch East India Company, ocean between South America and Africa and the Indian Ocean. We talked about how imperialization starts with trading posts. So first, companies go in, they make trading posts. Then they slowly start to gain political and military power in this region, and then the government takes over. So it's not like the British Army is going in and taking over India. It happens slowly over time. That's all for 6.1. The big idea from that is like the rationales for imperialization, social Darwinism, religion, things like that. Now let's talk about how the states expanded. State expansion. How does Great Britain grow its empire? How do the French grow, etc.? Number one, like I said, joint stock companies move into these countries first. You have to know that. Imperialism starts with companies, joint stock companies going and then growing in power in places like Africa and India. The other thing that you absolutely have to know for this unit is the idea that industrialized nations had huge military advantages over non-industrialized nations. So you're going to want to write that down. Industrialized nations had a massive military advantage over non-industrialized areas. And they were able to expand and consolidate and legitimize their power through the use of their industrialized military. It makes sense that the British Army is going to be able to stand up against a tribe in Africa. Is it fair? No, but that's why we see imperialization happen in this time period. So let's talk about imperialization in Africa really quickly. I'm not going to talk about every detail here, but it is interesting to know that Europe had always had a trade relationship with Africa. It started with the slave trade. Most people did not want to move to Africa until medicines like this quinine were discovered because it protected them against malaria, diseases that they did not have a natural immunity to. The British take control over the Suez Canal first. Why is the Suez Canal significant?
Trade.
You don't have to go all the way around the southern tip.
Perfect. It makes a quick water route between Asia and Africa, and it's used, like Brady said, for trade. So that gives Great Britain a lot of power, and at least in North Africa, they take it from the Ottoman Empire, who at this time just kind of sucks. And we start to see Great Britain set up little areas of power throughout West Africa. You'll notice that they do not come in and take over for political reasons first. They say, hey, we're going to establish Sierra Leone where we can send former slaves from the British Empire to live peacefully and happily. Hey, we're going to establish Gambia. That's going to be a base where we can stop the slave trade. That's where we're going to house the people that need to stop the slave trade. Hey, we're going to establish Lagos. This is where we're going to kind of base our power to annex other parts of Africa. So they go slowly and they build their power over time. We talked about how Europeans used treaties in Africa first. Do those treaties work, or does Europe honor those treaties? No, they do not. It's like the bait and switch. Like, we're going to make you trust us, and then we're going to abuse that power. The French also go into Africa at this time by establishing trading posts and taking land from the Ottoman Empire. This leads us to the scramble for Africa. You really need to understand this idea and its consequences. The scramble for Africa is all these European nations coming together, trying to get bits of Africa before it's all taken. Not like it hadn't been taken by indigenous people to begin with, right? But whatever. So this creates competition amongst European nations, and this guy, Otto von Bismarck, who led Germany at the time and didn't even want any part of Africa, said, hey, we need to come together as Europeans and determine what we're going to do with this so Europe does not fall apart over fighting over Africa. So he hosts the Berlin Conference where they make colonial boundaries of Africa. What do they ignore in the Berlin Conference? Africans, right? They ignore existing tribal boundaries. They ignore existing conflict in different regions, and they just make up borders in Africa, which allows for free movement of goods between Europeans, but as a result, also resulting in tension that exists today in Africa between groups of people that have hated each other for centuries and now are forced to live together. The only two countries, this is an interesting thing you might want to know, the only two countries that are not imperialized by Europeans by the 19th century are Liberia and modern-day Ethiopia, which you will see called Abyssinia in the book or on a test if you were to see
Didn't
that
Italy
word.
try taking out Abyssinia?
Yes, Italy, a couple different places did, and it's Liberia was protected by the United States, but Ethiopia legitimately held off European conquest, which is pretty cool. They used native techniques and a knowledge of their land to resist European imperialism successfully. All of this splitting up Africa and all this stuff leads to tensions that result in things like the Boer Wars. You don't have to know a ton of specifics about the Boer War, but do understand that it is a result of African imperialism. And basically what happens is we have Dutch descendants called the Afrikaners, and then we have the Black Africans, we have British people. The Afrikaners and the Black Africans were fighting against each other over land, but then Great Britain comes in and kicks them all off the land in the Boer Wars, and they are sent to the worst land in South Africa, and life becomes very difficult for the native populations of that. They're also pushed into concentration camps. There are white concentration camps and black concentration camps, and the conditions of the native African camps were significantly worse. There's a lot of media attention over the Boer Wars. We have this guy, King Leopold. What is unique about King Leopold and the Congo?
He got a Congo.
He what?
He owned it.
He owned it. He owned it personally. He used his own money to purchase the Congo because he wanted Belgium to imperialize. They didn't want to, so he was like, I'll just buy it myself. And how did he treat the native Congolese? Terribly. He loved cutting off people's hands. I was Google imaging when I made this PowerPoint. So many hands cut off.
Like, what was the point?
To scare people and as punishment. Yeah, and probably like for fun. He probably kind of liked it, so that's gross. He personally made $1.1 billion with a B. In today's money, he was a billionaire off of the harvesting of ivory and rubber. But eventually, what does Belgium do to King Leopold?
Oh, they just take it away from him.
They kick him out because the people of Belgium were like, this isn't working. It was a humanitarian crisis, and Belgium takes control. So now let's talk a little bit about imperialism in Asia, the basics. Here's what I'm going to have you write down. You need to know that South Asia is India. If you see South Asia, they are talking about India. What nation imperialized India? Great Britain. The other thing I want you to add to that piece of knowledge that you have is that prior to India, it was Spain and Portugal. And India kind of kicked them out to take control. The British East India Company comes in first. They're there to trade in spices, but eventually they start focusing on cotton. The next thing you need to know is that East Asia, if you see that, again, is China. East Asia is China. And what's happening in China at this time is that they're just becoming very weak. Well, coronavirus right now, yeah. Which we can talk about after the lecture because I've read some really weird stuff about that recently. So China is being weakened by numerous things. The Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, the Yellow River switching directions or courses causing drought and famine. Overall, what you need to know is that Europe at this time is being weakened. And that allows Europeans to come in and exert their control.
China's becoming weakened?
Sorry, China. China's becoming weak, which allows Europeans to come in and take control over trade in China. Imperialism in Japan, the big idea about Japan is that they see the rest of the cool kids imperializing, so they're like, I want to do it too. Just like industrialization. Not saying imperializing is cool, but they see other European nations doing it, so they want colonies. An interesting thing about Japanese imperialism is also that they were a very small island with a big population because they had industrialized and had a lot of food, so they literally were looking for places to send excess people. We have extra people, they need to go somewhere. Let's imperialize. They actually do grow a pretty large empire that exists until after World War II when they are, well, we'll get there. We'll get there later. Okay, so Southeast Asia, here's what you need to know about this region. Southeast Asia is like the Indian Ocean network. And what I want you to know about Southeast Asia is that the Dutch, the French, and the British kick out the Spanish and the Portuguese. Spain and Portugal had dominated trade in this region. This is like the Indian Ocean network. Spain and Portugal had dominated trade in this region. They are essentially removed from this area by the Dutch, the British, and the French. And they go there because of the Spice Islands and trade in things like spices.
With the Dutch, British, and who?
French. This slide is a perfect example of, do I need to know all of this stuff for the AP exam? Like, do I need to know that they go there for pepper, tobacco, palm oil, and rubber? No, but those are the kinds of things that are going to be very beneficial for you to know when writing your essays. That is good evidence to use in an essay. So stuff like this, the big picture is that these people were pushed out. They pushed out the Portuguese and the Spanish to dominate trade in this region. The other thing that might be interesting to know is that Siam, which is today Thailand, is the only place in this region that was not imperialized. Now let's talk about American imperialization. This is something that you will talk much more about in APUSH next year, but the big idea to know about America is that they were imperializers as well. They released the Monroe Doctrine. What did the Monroe Doctrine say?
Only they can.
Yes, stay away from North America. Why did it say stay away from North America? Because we wanted to imperialize North America. Europe, you can't do it because we would like to. So first we see the removal of indigenous peoples, like the Eastern Woodland people being sent to Indian territory on the Trail of Tears. Everyone listen to this. On the AP test, I think I've told you this before, but I just want to reiterate it. If you see the word Indian, it is always referring to people from where? India. Unless you see Indian Territory or the Indian Removal Act. Those two things are Native Americans in North America talking about that. Everything else, India, Indian.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why are they called Indians even though they're not from India?
Because when Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the New World for the first time ever in the history of the world, as he did, he thought he was in India. So that's the Monroe Doctrine. It's the idea that Europe cannot imperialize because we would like to imperialize. We see that evidenced in the Mexican-American War, where we take a bunch of territory from Latin America. Expansion of land, manifest destiny. That is the idea that Jesus Christ himself says the United States must expand from sea to shining sea. There's no other option. So that is an example of American imperialization. We bought Alaska from Russia. Russia really wanted to kind of control the sea between what is Alaska and Russia, but that didn't end up working out because, like we have talked about, Russia is always a little bit weird and a little bit unable to do what they want to do. Expansion overseas, we see imperialization in Hawaii. We see the Roosevelt corollary. This is very interesting because it says that any Latin American country who shows instability will be intervened on by the United States. What defines instability? Anything, right? The United States can be like, oh, it's raining a lot over there. It seems unstable. Let's go in. So the Roosevelt corollary is a perfect example of American imperialism and this idea that America wanted to control and police North America. We also see the United States take places like the Caribbean, Dominican Republic. We now have Puerto Rico, Guam. We are still an imperializing nation. Outcomes of imperialism. This is a lot of text. What did you say?
We're still getting new places.
Yeah, we have not acquired a new territory in quite a long time, but there are lots of places in the world that are territories or protectorates of the United States, but not states.
Interesting.
Yeah, like Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico should be a state. Hot take. But now we see Russian expansion. What do you need to know about Russian expansion? They expanded. Catherine the Great expanded. Then her grandson Alexander I continued to expand Russia. This will eventually turn into the land that is the Soviet Union. They wanted to have a joint stock company that was dominant like the two that we've studied. It's called the Russian-American Company. That's the one that wanted the sea land between the two areas. It doesn't end up panning out. What you do need to know, what I want you to really remember here, is that Russia was in competition with Great Britain for Afghanistan. Take a wild guess. Does anybody know who wins between
Afghanistan.
Nobody. Afghanistan. Yes, Afghanistan has a long history of resisting imperialization. And that is called the Great Game. The fight between Afghanistan and Great Britain between Russia and Great Britain over Afghanistan is called the Great Game. And no, there are no winners of the Great Game. Australia and New Zealand we're going to talk more about in just a second. That's 6.2. That one is the longest topic. So that one's going to take us the longest to get through. Everything else is going to move a lot quicker. 6.3 is indigenous responses to state expansion. What's important to know about this? Number one, you have Enlightenment ideas and Western-style education lead to rebellion. So Great Britain, or the imperializing country, goes into these colonies, subject nations, and they bring education with them. Did they want to educate the native population? No, they did not. But it was a natural reaction, a natural byproduct of imperialization was that natives became more educated in Western ideas like the Enlightenment. The other thing you want to know is that nationalist movements grew as a result of imperialization. So we see Indians coming together. We see Africans coming together under Pan-Africanism because of European imperialization. So we're going to talk first about the Balkans. Now, the reason the Balkans are important to know is because this really sets up the next unit. The next unit is World War I. We're already up to 1900. So our next unit is World War I, and that starts because of tension in the Balkan Peninsula. So Balkans are breaking free of Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire is very weak. They try to establish the Ottomanism. Does that work? No. Big ol' does not work. So they try to establish this Ottoman culture. It doesn't pan out. And we see nationalist and independent movements in the Balkan Peninsula. Eventually, these tensions, like I said, lead us directly into World War I. The other place that we see nationalism grow is in the Cherokee Nation. Now, the Cherokee Nation, the story of them is very sad because they did not try to rebel. They tried to assimilate. The Cherokees adopted a European-style constitution. They adopted European styles of writing, dress, and language. They adopted European jobs like farming and textile production and all that kind of stuff. This picture illustrates a Cherokee man trying to assimilate into European styles. What do we do to the Cherokees in response?
That's so sad.
We kick them off of their land. So first the United States says, and you'll talk more about this in APUSH, the United States says, you are an independent nation, Cherokee Nation. You have a constitution. You are your own country. Then they're like, but we want that land. So we're going to ignore the fact that you are an independent nation and kick you off of this land and move you to Oklahoma.
Why didn't the Cherokee kill us?
They are outnumbered and they were not as industrialized as the Americans were. Huh?
That's so sad.
They legally won. In the Supreme Court legally said, yes, Cherokee Nation, you do not have to move. And then President Jackson comes in and says, nah, go ahead, move them anyway. And he is later impeached. Yeah. So, but not good. The other important thing I want you to take about native populations is that rebellion here, this is something to write down. Rebellion was oftentimes encouraged by religion. So we see two examples of that. We see the ghost dance movement in the United States, and we see the Jawa or Zosha or something cattle killing movement in Africa. What did both of those movements have in common? They were very spiritual. They were based on this idea that we're going to do this thing that's going to bring people alive from the dead, and the spirits are going to remove the white man. So religion was also something that really motivated resistance. We also see this guy, Tupac. I Googled it. Tupac was named after him, legitimately. So there's Tupac and Tupac. This guy was the Incan guy who said he was a descendant of Incan royalty, and he tried to stroke nationalist sentiment in Peru for people to rise up against Spain. And what ended up happening to him? He was not just exiled.
Oh, he was killed.
He was killed. His whole family was killed, and he was killed. This is a painting of his killing. In my other class, and we can do it in here too if you would like, after the lecture, I will tell you all of my favorite methods of torture that I learned about in college. This is one of them. This is called drawing and quartering. Have y'all ever learned about this?
Oh, yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah. So it's where you get, huh? What?
You have way too much free time.
I learned about it in college. But you get drawn, you get drawn and quartered. You get tied to a horse, and then you get pulled. I was a history major. So.
Wait, what if just take off your arm?
You are quartered. So there's 4 horses that some are tied to your feet, some are tied to your arms, and then they shoot a gun in the air or something like that, or they hit the horses and they all run in opposite directions and they pull your body apart.
But that actually pull you
Will
apart.
that kill you?
I feel like it wouldn't.
Yeah, horses are very strong. So anyways,
I'd stay together.
I stay together. That is a nationalist movement that is rebelling against Spain in Peru. Is it successful? No. And then we have the French intervention in Mexico. France was like, let's imperialize Mexico. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to overthrow this president, Benito Juarez, that people really like. We're going to install this guy with this beard, His name is Archduke Maximilian, and he's going to be the new emperor of Mexico. And he's going to take with him his wife, who's kind of crazy. So they're there for about 3 years. These two people, I linked in, I do, Preston, have too much free time on my hands, and I listened to a podcast about them recently, and I linked in information about how to find that podcast because it's incredibly interesting because it talks about their time in Mexico, which was very bizarre, and then it talks about his wife going insane after he's eventually murdered. And it's just kind of like fun listening, you know? So Maximilian and his beard are put in charge of Mexico for 3 years, but eventually Mexico uprises against them. They reinstall Benito Juarez and he's murdered. So these movements are not super successful. Now, we're going to get to the Indian Rebellion of 1857. This is the Sepoy Rebellion. We know what this is. This is Muslim and Hindu sepoys working in the British Army. And they are upset over disrespect by the British government, disrespect of their religion, of their cultures, things like that. Here's the other thing that I want to point out that I did not point out in class, but you might want to like jot a note down about this somewhere. One of the things that prevented some of these movements from being successful is existing class disputes. So like, for example, we have Hindus and Muslims in India, and they do not get along, right? They did not get along under the Mughal Empire. It's not like Great Britain takes over and they suddenly get along. So there was already tension existing between these two groups of people in India, and they're unable to kind of come together to push out Great Britain. Does that make sense? So like existing tension between social classes or different groups of people prevent them from being successful against places like Great Britain in things like the Sepoy Rebellion and other nationalist movements. It would be like some country coming in and trying to take over the United States, but the Democrats and Republicans can't agree enough to even fight a war against some foreign person, right? It's something like that. So what are the outcomes of the Sepoy Rebellion? Number one, everybody write this down, nationalism grows in India. It is encouraged by rebellion, education, the ability to communicate, and the ability to move around because of transportation. So nationalism in India grows. The outcomes of this are that Great Britain ends the Mughal Empire, the British Raj, which is the British government in India, exists, and eventually Indians do come together despite religious or cultural differences to start calling for self-rule. The other ones we're going to talk about, the Philippine resistance. We already talked about this. Do you remember the propaganda movement in Jose Rizal in the Philippines from last unit? It was this guy, the propaganda movement. They weren't trying to break free from Spain. But they were trying to like get more self-rights because of the Enlightenment, and then they end up killing the guy and they get mad. So that's that. Vietnam, we're not going to talk specifically about, but basically this is important later on when we talk about the American war in Vietnam. Vietnam has a long history of resisting imperializing powers. They were able to fight off France for a long time, and that's kind of why America, this huge industrial power, was not as easily successful against Vietnam as we expect it to be. Australia and New Zealand is basically just the British against indigenous populations. Aboriginals in Australia, Maori in New Zealand. This is really interesting. The Aboriginals have lived in Australia since like the beginning of time. And recently, they tried to pass a law that Aboriginals could be deported from Australia.
Wait, like right now?
Where are they going to go? They're from Australia. Where are they going to deport them to? I don't know. The law didn't pass. It was struck down like 2 days ago. But they today tried to pass a law that the Aboriginals could be deported from Australia, a country that they are native to.
That's ridiculous.
Isn't that ridiculous? Yes. Yeah, I don't know. So the Aboriginals versus Australia, there's lots of tension there even to today.
I mean, it's always Tasmania.
Yeah, right. New Zealand is the Maori Wars, which you've already talked about. The Maori were people that were living on New Zealand. Great Britain says they're going to respect their land, but they don't. African resistance. I'm not going to talk specifically about these, but what you need to know is that they are not successful, right? None of these are successful. The Sokoto Caliphate was the largest empire in Africa since the 16th century. They tried to just create a new state and say, you can't imperialize us, but they did. And then these three movements, the Samurai Toure, Ya Santawa, and the Mahdist Revolt, none of them were successful. So that is the important thing to take away. These, again, they're called illustrative examples. They're things that are going to help you write really good essays on the AP exam. Do you have to necessarily know every detail about them? No. 6.4, global economic development. So this is economy, economic imperialization. Here's the things you need to know. Industrialization, encourage the search for natural resources. and colonial workers provided cheap labor. What practice is ending at this time? Slavery. So Europe's like, oh man, we got to find some way to replace slavery. Technological advancements. These are the things that practically made imperialization possible. Here's what you need to know about railroads. They allowed for travel to the interior of a colony. So for the first time ever, we don't have to focus on the coast because we have railroads, so we can very cheaply get into the interior of Africa, the interior of India, the interior of the United States. So that encourages imperialization. And it encourages migration because people can move. Cecil Rhodes, we talked about him and his diamond mines. Steamships obviously make travel much quicker, more efficient across water. Refrigeration means they can now take meat across water. Telegraph communication is instantaneous. I included another picture of the Titanic. I think I might try to put a picture of the Titanic on every slideshow.
I mean, yeah.
This is the Titanic crashing.
You can travel across the.
Yeah.
You could
How do
definitely
they have
travel
a
across
picture
Venice
of that?
assuming all the icebergs.
Because it was like 19 something something.
1912.
1912, 1910?
I didn't think they had
1912,
cameras.
Yeah, not
I mean,
great
you
ones.
could travel
but-
across the water assuming all the icebergs have melted already.
Right. But anyways, these are the things that practically made imperialism possible: railroads, steamships, telegraphs. Raw materials. Here's what you need to know. Great Britain is looking for cotton. Great Britain was getting cotton from the United States, but then what happened? The Civil War. So we have to take a pause on trading stuff. So we start to get our raw cotton from Egypt and India. In Egypt, is 93% of its exports are just cotton. What is that called when you focus on? Very good, a monoculture. They have one export that they are focused on. So what happens if Great Britain says, we don't want your cotton anymore? Their economy is donezo. That doesn't happen. Egypt is able to stay profitable through the sale of cotton, luckily, but it could. Rubber is the exact same thing. It happens in the Amazon rainforest. And then what does Great Britain do with rubber tree seeds? Yes, they take them to Malaysia and they sell it for cheaper. So what happens to the Amazon? Not good, not fun, not pretty. Rubber barons become a thing. That is rubber people that oversee rubber farms. You can kind of equate them to like plantation owners in cotton. Very mean, not nice. Other raw materials, we're looking for palm oil to lubricate machines and factories. Ivory, which is durable, very pretty, becomes sort of a luxury item. Minerals like silver, copper, tin, and gold. Why is tin important? Cans. So think about this. Prior to this time, the thing about tin is that it doesn't erode food. So you can put food in tin for a long time and it doesn't get messed up. Now we also have refrigerators. So there's food being produced in a different way. And then diamonds with Cecil Rhodes. We hate Cecil Rhodes. He's a racist and he is the sole reason that diamonds are so expensive. So if you ever want to buy a loved one a diamond ring and it's very expensive, then thank Cecil Rhodes because he and his company to this day still manipulate the price of diamonds. Have you ever seen a diamond mine before? Because I have not. This is what it looks like.
Why does it look like that?
I don't know. Huh?
Is like company still going today?
Yep. De Beers Diamonds is still one of the biggest diamond manufacturers in the world. They manipulate the price of diamonds. Yeah. Diamonds are like, it's like any rock that comes out of the earth. Like it's worth something, but it's not worth thousands and thousands of dollars. But because of price manipulation by this company, it's so expensive. Agriculture, we talked about how during this time, we see export economies go from a agricultural or subsistence farming to a monoculture. And we talked about how bad that is for the export economy because they become completely reliant on one crop and they no longer produce what?
Other crops.
Other crops, food. So now they are reliant on the imperial country for all of their food and all of their finished goods, and it just kind of sucks in general. The consequences of this are monocultures, long-term soil depletion, crop disease, pest spread. And again, there are places in the world today that are completely unable to diversify their soil and their crop production. They're still suffering from becoming a monoculture. 6.5, economic imperialism. We're almost done. These three move pretty quick. The big thing about economic imperialism is understanding that it is about money and resources. And understanding that examples of economic imperialism are like Great Britain entering the Opium War with China. So economic imperialism, you may want to write this little definition down. It's when foreign business interests have economic power or influence. over natural resources beyond their border. They typically exploit not just materials, but people. Export economies are the economy that is imperialized. So that is like Brazil or Argentina or Africa, things like that. We see economic imperialism exemplified in Hawaii. That is when, it's funny, it's interesting for me to think of, like, Hawaii is a state, right? It's a state in the United States. But that is an example of American imperialization because they had a monarchy that was functioning totally independently. We come in and kind of take it over. India, we already talked about how that's the British East India Company. They focus on cotton. The Dutch East Indies, they focus on spice trade in Indonesia. The culture system is an example of forced labor that replaced slavery. It's where they said you have to take 1/5 of your land and farm the cash crop, or you have to like basically work for free for 66 days. 66 days, that's an odd number, but that's what they picked. Economic imperialization in China. Everybody listen to this because I'm going to tell you a story about opium. So basically what happens is, who can tell me about the trade imbalance that existed? What is it?
That basically China, okay. That Europe is how do I explain this? Okay.
Want some help?
Well, it's like one of them is gaining something while the other.
One of them's gaining something and the other is not. Who's gaining?
China.
China, very good. So China is selling things like porcelain, tea, silk to Great Britain, and Great Britain is selling what to China?
Opium.
Nothing at this time. So that is Great Britain is like, no, that cannot happen. So we will sell opium to China, and we will get everyone addicted. And opium is not illegal. It is a plant that you smoke, you get high. It's also a painkiller, stress reliever. China's all about it. So China, because so much of their population is becoming addicted to opium, tries to make it illegal. Great Britain says, no, thank you. We're going to continue to sell opium in China. China says, all right, let's go to war. So what they do not realize, again, I want you to make a note of this if you don't have it in your brain. What this shows us is that industrialized nations are easily going to beat non-industrialized nations at this time. China had been the global superpower for thousands of years, arguably. And Great Britain was very easily able to overtake them because they had an industrialized military and China did not. So they come in, they fight, Great Britain wins, they do the Treaty of Nanking. It forces China to give Hong Kong to Great Britain, open 4 ports. Hey guys, this is the reason Hong Kong is having so much difficulty today. It traces all the way back to this. They're part of Great Britain, they have democratic roots, then they're later given back to China. So the thing I want you to know about the Opium War is that it is an example of economic imperialization. Write that down. Opium War is an example of economic imperialism. The second Opium War then happens where Great Britain is still pissed because opium is still illegal, and they fight again, they win again, and like I said in like 6.2, all of these things come together and they lead to China's decline. So the Opium War can directly be related to China's decline. They become so weak that they have to be split up into spheres of influence by major nations. So it's not that the British government is controlling China. It is that they have a sphere of influence that they get all of the trade rights to. Same thing with France and Japan and Russia. They split China up into all these different regions. Economic imperialism in Africa. The majority of Africa is a very vulnerable state at this time. A lot of places have been turned into monocultures through the imperialized nation. Food production has declined. Prices go up. In Africa, the major pieces of economic imperialism are cotton, and cocoa, palm oils, and peanuts, and obviously slavery, which in most parts of the world is abolished, but not everywhere. Economic imperialism in Latin America focuses mostly on rubber, people going to take rubber from places like Brazil. We also see a huge investment by Great Britain and Argentina. The United States is obviously imperializing at this time, taking over or spreading influence throughout. I had forgotten what Banana Republic meant until I put this slideshow together.
Did like the Banana Republics like rule parts of like South America?
They eventually do get some power, but the original definition of a Banana Republic is not very nice. It's like an unstable nation that focuses on the export of fruit and is controlled by a company and is like corrupt. So it's very interesting to me that we have a store called Banana Republic and nobody like says it's weird, but it is kind of weird. So that's what a Banana Republic is. Okay, now all we have to do is causes and effects of migration and we're done. Write this down. Why do most people leave a country? They're looking for economic opportunity, work. Someone who voluntarily leaves is usually looking for opportunity. We see 3 types of migration at this time: forced, coerced, or voluntary. Voluntary, they're looking for opportunity. Most people move to where?
America.
Not just America, but where?
America's.
Cities. Most people at this time are still moving to cities. We're still seeing urbanization take place after the Industrial Revolution. And the other key thing about migration is migration starts to be forced because there are so many needs as far as labor, right? We're still trying to fill the void that was left after slavery, and they do bad things. So migration through labor system, I want you to make a note that we see Indians moving all over the British Empire. That is called coerced labor through indentured servitude, coerced or semi-coerced. They're essentially tricked into going into these different parts of the British Empire. Chinese laborers go to California to work on railroads. Japanese laborers, oftentimes by choice, go to Hawaii, Peru, or Cuba to work on sugar plantations. Slavery is being abolished at this time in the world, but the United States is going to hold on until the bitter end, 1865. But slavery is existing in other parts of the world, especially by France in Africa. Indentured servitude is the big institution that replaces slavery. We talked about how it's like kind of voluntary, but it's really not very good. Doesn't work out for a lot of people. And then the other thing I want you to know is that this Asian contract laborers, there are people taken from Asia and put under contract. I put that in quotations. It's not really a contract. It doesn't protect their rights, but they are forced or tricked into working in different parts of the world at the time. And there's something like 500,000 Chinese are moved around the world under this contract labor system. French penal colonies and British penal colonies. So let's talk about the British first. Who was sent there? Convicts, right? Does anybody remember before the American Revolution where British convicts were sent? Georgia, yes. The colony of Georgia was originated for convicts, but after the Revolution, now they're sent to Australia. But what ends up happening over time is that Australia is not much of a punishment. People are like, sure, I'll go to Australia for a couple of years and be somebody's house servant and then be set free. So they stopped sending people there and started doing a more traditional prison system. At the same time, we see the French penal colonies, the Devil's Island, which is in French Guiana in Africa, and it was awful. If you ever have an opportunity to Google Devil's Island, I would do it because some of the stories out of there are like just sick. It's one of the most notorious prisons in the world. This is a mass grave. Here's a picture. The island is not very big. It's obviously abandoned. These are some pictures of it today. But it is really, truly one of the most notorious prisons to ever exist. It ended in 1938.
Where is it?
In French Guiana. It's off the coast of Africa. What is now just Guyana. A word that I need you to know for this topic is diaspora. A diaspora is mass immigration from one place over time. What is immigration with an E? Immigration. That means to leave. And then immigration with an I means to come, right? So there's mass immigration as a diaspora. The biggest example of a diaspora is the African diaspora because of slavery. But that was forced. Most diasporas happen because of poverty, political things, or famine by choice. India, remember, most Indians left to work somewhere around the British Empire, but Indians left because of poverty. Chinese people also left because of poverty, famine, all of those things that destabilized China, like the Taiping Rebellion and the Opium Wars, and they are looking again for opportunity in other parts of the world. The poor Irish, first of all, Great Britain gets rid of Ireland as an independent nation, absorbs it into the United Kingdom. They don't care for that too much. I would bet that in the next 5 years, Ireland will be an independent nation again. It will no longer be part of the United Kingdom. I would bet that would happen because of the UK leaving Brexit. Yeah. So I bet Ireland's going to vote in a referendum very soon to become independent. That'll be something to watch out for. But back in the day, Great Britain takes them in. Roman Catholics are persecuted. Farmers are being evicted from their land. And then the potato famine. Ireland is kind of an example of a monoculture. They relied on potato growth, and then the potatoes no longer grow because of a very rare plant disease, and they don't get potatoes for 4 years, and like 3 million people die. They mostly went to the United States and Great Britain to build railroads. Italians also leave because of poverty. 7 million Italians leave Italy in 40 years. They go to America, New Zealand. They're trying to escape things like organized crime, the mafia.
The mafia.
Yeah. The last little bit I want you to understand about this is that there is such a thing. Everybody write the definition of a settler colony. A settler colony is a permanent settlement. Imperialization is for goods, for resources, but there are places like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa that are established as settler colonies. These are places that they eventually want to be legally part of the empire, and they want people to leave and spread the culture there. The kind of people that move are like technical experts, engineers, and geologists. They move and stay permanently. A lot of people go to Argentina because it was an awesome place to live at the time. And Japan tries to imperialize Mexico, but it doesn't work out. They don't have enough power. Again, the thing that I want you to write down or understand from this topic is what we talked about at the beginning. Improvements in transportation allowed people to migrate permanently. Without the cheap transportation, people would not have been able to move as freely as they did. So write that down if you're writing stuff down. People were able to migrate because of improvements in transportation. Makes sense, right? Now we have railroads and steamboats and things like that. And obviously, most immigrants settle in cities. Okay, this is the last topic. Y'all have done great. Effects of migration, pretty simple. If you know these three things, you're good to go. Number one, migration led to demographic changes. Number two, most migrants were male, leading to changes in the home culture. 3, new and old cultures mixed. 4, racial and ethnic prejudices arose. That's the hallmarks of this topic. Those 4 things are the most important things to know. So the roles of women change because it's mostly men that are leaving. What happens to women in home countries during migration? Yeah. They take roles that traditionally belong to men. They have more power with money. They have more power in decision making. Lives change because it's mostly men that leave. Remittance is a vocab word that you're going to want to know. This is when someone moves to make money and sends that money home. It usually has pretty positive effects on the home culture. Now we're going to talk about the receiving society. That is the place where the immigrants go to. The Chinese create ethnic enclaves all over the world. You have to know what that word ethnic enclave is. It's just like a community that retains a lot of the culture of the immigrants that live there. The Chinese are thriving in Southeast Asia. They're managing opium farms. They're working for the government. They're super excited about being there. China controls trade, and the reason there's still huge Chinese populations in the Indian Ocean area. They come to the Americas for gold. They stay for the railroads. Not as well liked in America. We'll talk about that in a second. And they leave their cultural stamp all over the world with fusion foods and things like that. Italians moved to Argentina at the point where 55% of Argentinians today are of Italian descent. Why do Italians move to Argentina? Well, there's a lot of land. There's not a lot of people. There's a lot of high-paying jobs. So they are able to raise their standard of living pretty significantly. This is an example of like the new littles. Like if you go to New York, you'll see like Little Italy, Little China, Little Greece, Little France. Those are all ethnic enclaves. In Africa, we see a lot of prejudice against the Indians that go there, particularly the Hindus and Muslims. And that will eventually lead us to the rise of Gandhi. We'll talk more about him later on. But we see reactions to prejudice. In Southeast Asia, Indians are still moving in a way that is forced because they are servants there. And then the Indians in the Caribbean are like actually very welcomed into the Caribbean. Final thing we're going to talk about is reactions to immigration. So in the United States, we almost immediately see negative reactions to Chinese immigration. In California, they pass all of these laws about where Chinese people can live. And if they're citizens or not, surprised, they say they're not. And that eventually leads us to like the Chinese Exclusionary Act. Does anybody remember how long the Chinese Exclusionary Act was initially? 10 years, and then it was renewed and made permanent. And then we see White Australia, where they tried numerous times to pass legislation to slow the influx of Chinese people into Australia. It doesn't work. And then the White Australia policy happens. It exists till the 1970s, which is probably why Australia is still trying to kick out Aboriginal people today, because there's a history of extreme prejudice in Australia against non-white people. So what is the reaction? Prejudice. The end. Great job. Don't forget to look over the document.